Welcome back, grade 9, and today we are going to take a look at using our 5 senses to create imagery in our writing. Let's practice one more skill before we write. So we have our first writing task, one writing task coming up here in the next couple of lessons. You're going to be asked first to do a close reading on your own. So before we do that, I'm going to give you one more thing to look for. You are going to look for 5 senses in writing, and you are going to use everything you've learned so far to create a really good piece of reflective storytelling. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. First, let's take a look at how we can take a piece of writing to express and reflect, and make it vivid and interesting instead of just a bland list of events. So one way that we can do that, grade 9, is using our 5 senses to create imagery. There are lots of ways to create descriptive writing, but we are going to use our 5 senses today. So when we read, we react best to a story that infuses little pieces of the scene into the tale. So things that are going on in, say, the coffee shop where the main character is sitting and stressing over the task that they have to complete, maybe little elements of a sound, the door jingling, the sound of the espresso machine coming to life, that helps the reader feel like they're there experiencing the story. If a scene takes place in a cafe, for example, what are some sensations that you might experience when it comes to, and then let's take a look at these. So sound, as I mentioned, the door jingling, the bell jingling as someone opens the door, the sound of the barista taking someone's order, the espresso machine coming to life. I hear lots of kind of utensils tapping against dishes, that sort of thing. Sight is another sense. So what might that character see in a cafe? Well, they may see people walking by on the street. They may see interesting people coming in to have a coffee, right? They may see an argument take place, and that's a way that you can build some suspense. If your main character's feeling a bit jumbled up or scared, you can create scenarios in the cafe that make the reader feel that tension, right? So think of sound, think of sight, think of taste. If you're in a cafe, that's perfect. Your narrator can take a sip of the sweet, bitter taste of coffee and enjoy the taste of that while also commenting maybe on the smell, okay, the aroma. Make a metaphor or a simile to really bring a smell into the situation. If you're on a farm, right, think constantly when you're reading when you're writing, what elements of 5 senses, the smell, the taste, the sight, the sound, and coming up next, touch and feel, what elements would be present in that place? So if we're on a farm, if we're in a barn, right, the barnyard smells are so unique and so strong that you can write the smell that overcame the narrator was much like 1,000 garbage bags piled on top of them, right? We can be dramatic with our comparisons, but really, and then finally, touch and feel. So what might the character experience as far as what they feel physically when they're standing on the edge of the CN Tower at the very top, doing an edge walk out around the tallest building in Canada, compared to, what they might feel laying on a beach in Mexico. So by looking for, the first thing we're going to do is look for examples of the 5 senses in some writing, and then later on in this lesson you are going to look for it on your own in your choice reading novel, and then you're going to pull a few examples out and write it in your writer's notebook, and that will be very good practice for when I ask you to include some 5 senses in your first and second writing tasks. So grade 9, one important thing with this is that we're not going to overdo it, right? In the coffee shop, we don't want to have a sound and then something, vision, sight, and then a taste sensation, and then a smell, all in a couple sentences, because that's going to be overwhelming, right? So less is more. Sometimes, if you've heard that saying, less can sometimes have more of an impact. But to see what this looks like, we are going to first take a look, before I send you to look at it on your own, at a mentor text again. Now, this one is in a PDF just above this video. You can open it up and follow along if you would like. Or for this one, I'll give you the option just to follow along and watch with me. Because we are not going to read the entire story, this is from a novel. It's from a memoir called From the Ashes, My Story of Being Métis, Homeless and Finding My Way by Jesse Thistle. And Jesse Thistle's Canadian, and he has roots in Saskatchewan. So we are going to read just the opening to this memoir, to this novel, and we are going to look for just how much of the 5 senses this author has infused into his writing to help improve our writing. Okay, so the first thing I've done here is just made, and we're only going to read a couple of pages, just as a little taste, because you're going to be asked to do this on your own at the end of this lesson, and then again in the next lesson, you're going to do your own close reading individually. All right, so again, you don't have to print this off, you don't have to hand this in, just follow along for this one. We are looking for good examples of 5 senses in pink, I've decided, or sorry, green, this is green, I've decided. Those are examples that I think are, and that I think, so you may disagree with me and you can do your own, you can have your own opinion, you can do your own annotating. These are the examples I will highlight in green are examples I think are good examples of 5 senses writing. And then because we're going to be critical, we always have that critical head on. We're always thinking, how can we improve? I'm going to highlight any examples of the 5 senses where I think there are room for improvement in pink. So green, good to go, right? Pink, stop and think. That's just what I'm going off of. But again, you can develop your own way of reading like a writer. Chapter 1 is called Road Allowance. My Cookham Nancy's palm felt leathery in mine as we walked alongside of the train tracks. Instantly, we have a sense. This is something you might not have noticed if you weren't doing a close reading on your own, but my Cookham, or Cookham, which can mean grandmother in Indigenous cultures, Nancy's palm felt leathery. It felt leathery in mine. Touch. And I'm just going to label that straight away. Touch. Stands of poplar swayed and bent in the wind. Okay, so again, we have poplar swayed and bent. It's an image, right? That's sight. That's what that main character is seeing. And I'm not going to label every single one, but maybe I'll label the first example of each. Again, this is just, there's no right or wrong way to annotate. You can develop your own way. And she stood still for a second to catch her bearings and watch the flat-bottomed late spring clouds slouch by. Good verb there. We talked about that last time. But sight, Cookham Nancy is watching the flat-bottomed late spring clouds slouch by. So another sight, I'm not going to label that one because I've already labeled one sight. She mumbled. That's hearing. Then began thrusting her gnarled walking stick into the tall brush ahead, spreading it open, looking for flashes of purple or blue. Now, grade 9, we could highlight almost anything in here. For example, here we have an image of Cookham Nancy thrusting her gnarled walking stick into the tall brush ahead, spreading it open, looking for flashes of blue. This is still sight, right? This is stuff that the narrator is seeing. However, we could probably highlight the entire chapter with sight. So from now, I'm not going to highlight everything like, you know, Nancy is walking, unless it's a very clear image, okay? And I'll explain what I mean in a second. Then began thrusting her gnarled walking stick into the tall brush ahead, spreading it open, looking for flashes of purple or blue. Purple was a clear sign that the pregnant Saskatoon berry bushes were ready to give birth and ease the winter suffering of bears, birds, and humans. The main point of those sentences aren't about the image of the Saskatoon berries, they're about the purpose of the Saskatoon berries in the story. So I'm going to move on. Berries, Cookham said, knew well their role as life givers, and we had to honor and respect that. We did that by knowing our role as responsible harvesters, picking only what we needed and leaving the rest for our animal kin so they could feed themselves and their young. This is like the reflect piece, isn't it? But we're not looking for that today. That was our pact, she said, and if we followed it, they'd never let us down. My Cookham wore brownish yellow eyeglasses the size of teacup saucers. Now, this is a very clear image. They've used a simile, the size of teacup saucers. I guess that's more of just a comparison, but my Cookham wore brownish yellow eyeglasses the size of teacup saucers. And I'm highlighting that because that is very clearly sight. That is very clearly something that the main character is supposed to see. I'm not going to highlight, I'm not going to label that because I've already labeled one sight. But her eyes could still see things my 3-year-old eyes couldn't. Now it's talking about seeing there, but it's just talking about seeing. We're not seeing an image, okay? I always tried to search out berry patches before she did, but She always got there first. Always. As we waded deeper through the railside grass and reeds, a vast fleet of mosquitoes and gnats lifted from the ditch floor and enveloped our heads. So I think that that is definitely a very strong image. A few flew into my mouth, choking me. I coughed is the word. I combined coughed and batted into one. If your mind ever does that when you're reading, that's totally fine. Our brains weren't originally, our brains didn't evolve to read words on a page like this. We created writing and reading, and we created all of this after our brains had evolved. So it's confusing. You just think about people having read all the time, but it is an unnatural thing for us to do. So that's why we practice. This here, a few flew into my mouth, choking me. I coughed and batted at the air. I feel like this is touch sensation, right? I coughed and batted at the air. This is showing us what the narrator feels in that moment physically, but I think there's room for improvement in this one, because I think he could have said in here somewhere, flew into my mouth, choking me. It felt like, and then he could have written a simile there to really make us feel what he did in that moment. But again, am I being picky? Probably, because I said I would look for some to improve. No, Jesse, Kokum grabbed my arms and held them. They are our relatives. So he was swatting at the gnats and mosquitoes around his head. Kokum shares her worldview. They are our relatives. Never do that. I'd never seen her angry before, but she was now. As the black cloud intensified around us, again, I think that's a good image with sight there. She drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes, and spoke softly in Michif. So she's speaking softly in an indigenous language, and that is definitely hearing. And I'm only labeling that because I don't think we had any on our first page. She pointed to me in our half-full pail of berries, and then to the rat root plant that protruded out of her dress pocket. Again, a little image there. I'm going to highlight that one in pink, because I think it could have given us a bit more of an image. Protruded out of her dress pocket like, or protruded out of her dress pocket in the fashion of, or protruded out of her dress pocket seeming more like this than this. That would have given us maybe a better image there. Her voice sounded like warm summer air. I'm struggling today, grade 9. Bear with me. Her voice sounded like warm summer air swooshing over the open prairie right before rain comes, and reminded me of when I'd accidentally disturbed the hornet's nest behind the smoke shed. That's beautiful. No imagery in there, but beautiful. There was no anger in her voice then. The plume of insects, maybe that is a nice subtle little hearing. There was no anger in her voice then. The plume of insects hovered mid-air for a second, then flew skyward and dispersed. And that's good because that is a sight. Just like the hornets had done. I looked at her in amazement, and my mouth opened, but no sound came out. I strained to hear any buzzing. So again, my mouth opened, but no sound came out. I strained to hear any buzzing. So we have speaking, lack of speaking, silence. I strained to hear any buzzing, but there was only the call of a loon far in the distance, followed by the shuffle of Kokum's moccasins. So hearing, seeing, hearing, right? They're everywhere. Oh, my silent one, Kokum said. I just told them we have a job to do. Her brown face cracked into a smile. I asked them to visit us later, if they must, but for now we need to concentrate. She brushed a few strands of hair from my face and hoisted me over a puddle. So these are both touch sensations, right? Grandma reaches down, brushes a few strands of hair from his face, and then lifts him up over a puddle. Those are both touch. Or maybe they're right. Maybe it's quitting time. Let's get back, she garçon. We have enough to make a good bannock. I loved Kokum's bannock more than anything. Even harvesting with her, listening to her stories, or hearing her sing. She made it whenever we visited. We lived in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, about an hour's drive away from my grandparents. Their cabin was in Erin Ferry, near Debden, just south of Big River, between the old Highway 1 on one side and the new Highway 55 on the other. The CN Railway cut right up the center of the road allowance, connecting Debden to Big River and on to the rest of Saskatchewan. That is very neat because there's a lot of local places in there. If any of you are from or have been to those places, I know I passed through Prince Albert a lot on the way up to the cabin. I have friends from Debden and Big River, and I've traveled that old Highway 55, or sorry, the new Highway 55. So I have personal connections to those few elements in the story, and even just seeing Saskatchewan mentioned in the novel is pretty neat. My grandparents' log cabin wasn't like any other place I knew. Mum told us that her dad, Musham, so that's Grandpa, Musham Jeremy Morissette, had made it by hand, the log cabin, from the surrounding aspen hardwood after our family lost our homestead in Park Valley a few kilometers away. It took him one season to fell the trees, strip them of bark, and build it, and another half season to chink in the cracks with mud and moss, waterproof the roof, and make it ready for winter living. Nobody else had a neat house like my Kokum and Musham, way out in the country, in the middle of nowhere, with no water or electricity. Now, we've just read two quite large paragraphs without any examples that I have stopped and found of our five senses. So we can think about what that means as far as storytelling goes, grade 9, but if we're looking at this already, there was quite a bit at the beginning. There are some large sections without any, and I want you to think about why that might be. Okay, let's just finish off these last few sentences here and see if this pattern continues, or maybe if we slip into some more of the five senses. Musham said there weren't many people like us anymore, rebels who fended for themselves. Maybe a few Arcand relatives down the road, but that was about it. The rest had sold out and got farms or went to the city to find work. He didn't own his land. It belonged to the Queen of England. She doesn't mind us being here, Musham said. Now again, he said it, but I don't think the author maybe didn't go to the full extent of how far he could have taken that, because Musham said, he could have let us know more about Musham's voice, what it sounded like. This is his grandfather, right? So, Musham said with his voice sounding like the wind in the trees, that would have given us a better sound, right? So I'm just going to highlight that in pink as room for improvement. But I think we've noticed that the storyteller has gone from establishing the scene with all these images and touch and feeling and smell and whatnot to actually launching into the story, telling us about the people. Right? But we need to kind of establish ourselves in the images of the swaying grasses and the mosquitoes and the prairie sunshine first. And it lets me hunt and trap freely and be my own boss, which I like. He told us stories about how our people had once lived in large communities in handmade houses just like his all over Saskatchewan, living off the land. But that was before the government attacked us and stole our land during the resistance, before our clans fell apart. I couldn't understand what he was talking about. I tried imagining villages of our people living like he and my Kokum did, in their little log house, all squished onto little pieces of land owned by the Queen, and I couldn't. But there were beaver, muskrat, deer, bears, elk, and fish everywhere, forest, streams, and rivers all around to play in, and no neighbors for miles and miles. If someone tries to push us around, we just pick up and move somewhere else, Musham said. We live like this to be free, like our ancestors. I understood that. What a beautiful section. I think here I tried imagining villages, and then some of the stuff that follows down here paints a little bit of an image of that. It's almost like a half sight. He says, I could almost imagine this, and then proceeds to describe things to us. So it's almost like a half image there. But again, we're very light on the five senses once we've launched into the actual meat of the story. When Kokum and I came back from berry picking, Musham was standing at the front door of the cabin. The elk horn buttons that fastened his beige leather vest strained to hold it together over his rounded stomach. That is definitely a really strong image. That's what I mean, grade 9, in we walked down the street and then we went here and then we went there. Sure, the characters would be seeing things, but this is a really good example of the author actually creating a strong image. This paints itself in our head for us, so it is sight. The elkhorn buttons that fastened his beige leather vest strained to hold it together over his rounded stomach. I can see Musham in my head now. Kokum made all of Musham's clothes from animals he trapped and materials she traded for in Debden on her monthly visit to town. Thank you so much, grade 9. That is your first practice with identifying the 5 senses in writing. I hope that makes sense. In the next lesson, you're going to be asked to do a close reading of something that is filled with the 5 senses, and you're going to look for them yourself. Thanks again.